This briefing will look at assignment 1, your first assignment for the course. So I'm going to just unpack some of the important key ideas that you can look at, and hopefully this will guide you as you read and then put together your essay. So let's begin. So your essay looks at, I'm looking at issues of marginalization and exclusion in South African schools. So I want you to draw on the Education White Paper 6. I want you to draw on the Salamanca Framework for Action, the Dakar Framework for Action, and also the Create Educational Access. There are some nice readings there that you can use, and I will show you at the end of the presentation how to get there and how to find some of those, just to give you some context as to issues of marginalization and exclusion in South African schools. So I've given you a quote where it says there, in order to attract and retain children from marginalized and excluded groups, education system should respond flexibly and must be inclusive, actively seeking out learners who are not enrolled and responding to flexibility to the circumstances and needs of all learners. And we know that in South Africa, we have huge contextual realities that are keeping learners out of school. And we also know that the principled response for inclusive education is to minimize these issues that some of our learners are having and maximize their participation and access to schooling. So that is exactly what the essay is all about. That is your focus. So when I talk about a principled response to inclusion, what I'm saying there is the principled response would be that we examine all the issues and realities that marginalize and exclude. So when you're looking at that, and when I ask you to critically account, that's what I want you to be thinking of. I want you to say, there are these issues, therefore, if we look at inclusion, these issues may be minimized. And where this comes out of is the Dakar and the Salamanca statements that you will be using to guide your thoughts and guide your understanding. And remember, Salamanca was 1994. It was the first, one of the first frameworks, and then Dakar happened in 2000. So it's the two of those policies talk to one another in terms of the notion of education for all. So remember that when you're actually putting things together. And then the principled response would be, if I want inclusion, I have to focus on exclusion, because without that, I cannot include anyone, because I have to look at what's excluding those learners from the classroom. So again, just remember, exclusion must be at the back of your mind, and marginalization. You can, in your essay, give a little bit of a definition, should you wish to, of what exclusion and marginalization is, but remember, you will be drawing on examples. All right, so some of the aspects that we might consider in the essay, because remember, this is what marginalization and exclusion can look like as key issues, but I'm not expecting you to give me every single one in this essay. Remember, you're right at the beginning of your course, so therefore you're only slowly chipping away at some of the aspects. So please don't think you have to throw the whole thing in, not at all. You would be looking at policy development, because you're going to be looking at Education White Paper 6. You'll also be looking at the two very important frameworks, Salamanca and Dakar. And then what you might touch on is certainly a little bit in terms of inclusive learning environments. What does it mean to include? Who benefits from the current arrangements of schooling? You might be looking at information and accessibility in terms of how do we include? What does access to education really mean? And then, of course, you'll be looking at the issues that do marginalize learners in South Africa, certainly, and globally. We'll look at things like poverty, gender, race, HIV, AIDS, disability, and language. And again, I'm not expecting you to include all. I would be very happy, because I want quality and not quantity, if you even just focus on two of those. So you might want to say poverty, gender, race, AIDS, disability, language are huge contextual factors that affect learners in South Africa and exclude them from access to schooling. However, in this essay, I will be focusing on two of those aspects or three of those aspects. So please just remember that when you're actually doing your planning. So if we just look at what an inclusive approach to education for all is, because remember, education for all was the first sort of getting together of international nations, of people advocating for inclusive education. So again, in your essay, you might mention education for all, that the whole notion of universal primary education. If you read Dakar, if you read Salamanca, those are two of the most important, that is the important signpost. Education for all, and then universal primary education, because we know, even with the Millennium Development Goals, that there are still many learners that are out of school in Africa, globally, and certainly in South Africa. In South Africa, many of our learners are out of school because they are now child-headed, they are child-headed households. They have lost family members due to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and therefore they are now forced to be at home to look after younger siblings. Some have dropped out of school, especially in the Western Cape, due to drug abuse and due to also unemployment, trying to find employment to feed their families. So those young kids, especially amongst Cape-coloured youth, if you read Bram Fleischer's work, you'll see that many of those learners are now out of school. They've dropped out, and sadly, they've joined gangs. So they've resorted to crime and violence and things that we shouldn't be exposing our youth to. But it's happening, it's out there. There are some learners that may drop out of school for a term or two because they have to look after their parents who may be ill or look after younger children, so they tend to miss school. There are also learners who have dropped out of school in South Africa, sadly, because school has not provided that safe, inclusive environment for them. So they are actually have just given up. They've realized they keep failing, they become dropouts, and they just leave school and they don't continue. So these are all the factors that we can consider. But again, for this essay, I'm certainly not expecting you to bring everything in. I'm expecting you to focus on issues that talk to you in terms of answering the question, because we haven't delved deep enough into all the aspects, and that will come later. So we can also, if you want to, just look at the Convention of the Rights of the Child, because that's very important, because that links to the issues of marginalization. So you can just look there. I'm not going to go through the slide, but it's something there for you to have a look at. Those are the different articles that talk to including rather than excluding. So how are you going to go about doing this? First thing, please make sure you refer to the White Paper 6, Education White Paper 6. And please, I have given you in the first lecture how I'd like you to cite it. Please don't ever just write Education White Paper 6 or White Paper 6. There are probably 30 million White Paper 6s in the educational policy development. Please be specific as to which policy you are using. And then you'll be looking at the Salamanca, of course, and the Dakar, and going back to the quote that I gave you. So let's just break up some of the stuff and look at the global perspectives as well. So as I say, these are all of them, and there are more now, because remember, I've stopped at 2006. There are plenty more drafts and policies that have been written now, but I only want you to focus on the two in blue right now. But just have a wide picture of where it all fits in. So you see how it wasn't just Salamanca and then Dakar. There were lots of conventions that came before as well, and lots of conventions, as I say, that have come way after 2006 as well. You will only focus on those two for this specific essay. So if we look at the framework of action, okay, just remember that what they have said in the Salamanca is, very importantly, that every child should be in a school. Not only children who are considered normal, but even looking at anybody, any child that needs to be educated should be educated together. And I think that's the most important thing there. So it also goes on to talk about, regardless of any physical or intellectual or social or linguistic issue, learners should be in schools and they should not be disadvantaged. And we know, unfortunately, this is happening. We have kids that are not in school across all spheres of society, and we need to unpack why and get those kids into school. I also didn't mention earlier the notion of teenage pregnancy. That is huge as well, and it's a huge issue, especially in South Africa. About 5 years ago, I haven't looked at the stats lately, but about 5 years ago, the youngest learner to fall pregnant was a learner in grade 4. So be aware of these issues, okay? Because that's another notion and another idea that we could discuss, and we will look at later on. Also remember, if we develop these inclusive schools, what Salamanca says is these will be effective ways of combating the discriminatory attitudes to create those welcome communities. So there, people in blue, is the principled response to inclusion, so that you just get an idea of what I'm asking you for. If we just carry on and go on, I've given you a little bit more there so you can read that as well, just to get an idea. I'm not going to read the slide. I've put it there for you to have a look at. Also remember that one of the issues, because it also falls under the umbrella of UNESCO, we have to ensure that special needs education forms part of every discussion when dealing with education for all. We have to look at teacher education programs. This won't fit into your essay, but it's just important for you to see the wider picture. Also, we need to stimulate the academic community to do more research. That is where you're sitting now. You've come in to become an inclusive activist. You've come in to learn. You've all said in your motivations that you wrote, you want to learn more. You want to develop more inclusive practices. You want to understand the research behind it. That's where you're sitting now. And also then it just looked at funding, and looking at funding between different periods to see where they could start developing. And if we look at Dakar and we look at Salamanca, we know that in some areas it has failed. The reason being that we've had bigger issues happening. Okay, and now with COVID as well, that's created another layer to this very complex issue. So it's something you can also think about in the back of your minds. So the framework in Salamanca also said that all learners can learn together. We've got to move away from saying that learners that have specific needs need to be isolated and separated into other schools. So we'll look at that. And also when we look at White Paper 6, you'll see how South Africa has tried to mediate this, where we talk about ordinary schools. In overseas, it's often referred to as regular. We have ordinary schools. We have special schools. However, those special schools are actually resource centers. They are supposed to be the collaborative tool between the ordinary schools, so they can come and get help and get support. So it's reinforcing and strengthening those special schools. Okay, and then we have the full service schools, which are supposed to be our schools that are fully inclusive. And we do have a number of full service schools that have been established, but also, unfortunately, we haven't reached that gold standard yet. We still have lots of issues that we have to deal with on the way. And then if you look at SLE and you look at the video that you're going to watch during this week, and you look at what I spoke about in my first lecture, SLE says we've got to move into that newer avenue of inclusion. We've got to actually dismantle and get rid of those special schools. And that's a huge contentious issue as well. But it's just something for you to think about as we move through your learning journey. So also in Salamanca, just again, the areas of concerns at the bottom there where I've highlighted, very important. This is something that you would draw into your essay, because all these factors here are factors that lead to exclusion of learners and exclusion of access to schooling. Health is a huge thing. Malnutrition, huge issue with early childhood education. Many learners are not at school, they're at home. They're not being educated across the world. And we know that our Department of Education has put in a lot in terms of early childhood education, which is really, really good. They've really brought in a number of projects. They, at the moment, are busy training. I hate the word training. Rather, let's say they are busy developing practitioners, quality practitioners that can work in those ECD environments. So those are some of the things that you can also bring in to your essay. Dakar also just says that when they looked at the EFA, People is Education for All, there are more than 800 million children under 6 years of age in the world, okay? Fewer than a third benefit from any form of childhood education, early childhood education. Some 113 million children go to school, 60% of whom are girls, and many have no access to primary schooling. And I know in Avi's section, you will be looking at the Millennium Development Goals, and one of the goals there is to get girls into schools, because especially in African countries, girls are often taken out of school because they are the ones that are running households or working in the fields, cultivating because food is required. So those girls are often, it's not a society expectation that those girls should get an education. And that's something that governments are trying to dismantle, okay? Because everybody has a right to education, no matter what gender you are. So that's something to remember as well. And then also, and we know this in South Africa too, a number of adults are illiterate. They have not had that opportunity and that access to schooling. So that's something you can consider as well. So also, if we look at things in terms of what Dakar said, they said, when we have to meet collective commitments as a community, as a global community, remember South Africa has signed and ratified all these policies and conventions as well. We need to be transparent and accountable. And also we have to look at developing partnerships. That is why also in South Africa, you'll see the European Union have come in. They're doing the most remarkable work in funding projects to be more inclusive, to assist schools in being more inclusive. So we're very lucky to have this global community that's also coming in to assist where South Africa needs help in terms of developing access to schooling for all. So Dakar also mentioned there that the tragic reality is that sometimes we haven't reached everyone that we need to reach. We still have many communities that are living in unsafe environments, in unhealthy environments, in environments where there isn't that fulfillment of life. Education is a human right, people. It's a basic human right. And many people do not have access to that basic human right. It's because of issues like poverty, being excluded. And we know also there are cultural beliefs that also exclude learners from schools. Kids who are albino kids are often ostracized by society. They're othered because they are different. They are not put into schools. In some rural areas, in research that I did a number of years ago, we found learners were kept at home if they were blind. Society didn't even know, the community didn't even know that that person had given birth to a child who was blind. Why? Because it's seen as something that has happened within the community, and it's seen as something that is evil. We've got to look beyond those cultural lenses, which is also very difficult. How do you say to a parent, when you said to them, the child is really not doing well, we need to put some support in place, and that parent just says, oh, well, I'm just going to go home and that child's going to get a good beating. And then we have the law of corporal punishment, no corporal punishment in schools. How do you mediate that cultural divide? It's very difficult. So those are the things we also sometimes need to be really concerned about and work about ways of mediating how we deal with that. So if we look at White Paper 6, okay, we need to think about what does inclusion look like and how is this policy a principled response to exclusion? Now here I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek because there are some issues of White Paper 6 that still talk to medical deficit model. But again, for this essay, all I'm wanting is for you to see the principles and the philosophy behind it. Those other contentious issues we're going to come to later and have lots of arguments about it. So what I'd like you to do with White Paper 6 is read the introduction to the policy by Kader Asmal, who was the then Minister of Education in 2001, because there he outlines a number of embedded philosophies behind inclusive education. Then on page 6 also, look at how South Africa defines inclusive education. Then page 7 to 12 as well, it provides a good discussion of exclusionary barriers that are prevalent in South African educational context. There you can draw from those and bring those in to say why then inclusion is a principled response to exclusion. Also, just I've pulled out from the White Paper 6 there, They talk about negative attitudes to and stereotyping of differences. They talk about barriers in terms of an inflexible curriculum, inappropriate languages. We know many of you who are teaching in government schools, but also those of you who are in private schools, you know that we have a huge barrier in terms of language. The language of learning and teaching, is often completely disjointed from the child who is sitting in your classroom. We have many learners that come to school. English might be their fourth language that they are learning. And now this becomes a barrier to learning. So that's something that's a huge contentious issue, even to this day. Inappropriate communication, inaccessible and unsafe built environments. You saw that when you watched the news and saw newspaper articles now with COVID and reopening of schools. Many schools were not ready, and I would like to say are still not ready in terms of bringing learners in because of lack of toilets. There are still schools that are using pit latrines, and we know that there have been issues with that as well, of children drowning in those pit latrines. That is inaccessible. That is not inclusive. That is exclusive. You're excluding learners from basic rights. Also, inappropriate and inadequate support services. We know that this is a huge issue as well. We have got very good workers working and stakeholders working to develop partnerships to enable inclusion, but we know that we are not there yet. In some cases, there might be one district official who's put in charge and they have to look after over 80 to 100 schools. That is absolutely humanly impossible for one person to do. Also, inadequate policies and legislation. That is something we're going to look at as well. Sometimes there's always a disjuncture between policy and practice, and that's something we need to consider. It's all very well to have a policy, but let's look at the grassroots and see what's happening on the actual ground where teachers are actually navigating environments every single day in their daily lives in the classroom. Also, the non-recognition and non-involvement of parents. That's quite difficult as well. Sometimes parents are unable to come to parent meetings or parent evenings due to a number of factors. And it also depends on which divide you are, the socioeconomic divide. And that's why I want you to always consider who benefits from the current arrangements of schooling, who benefits from a school having parent evenings. You have a parent evening, you have a parent who is living in an area where there may not be a taxi that's actually operating at night. That parent may have to take 2 taxis to get to the school. Who's it benefiting? We've got to start reshaping our thinking. We've got to start reshaping. It's excluding that parent from coming because they can't get the transport. There's lack of transport to get there. So be careful when you sometimes make the assumption and say, oh, those parents don't care about their child. They never come to a parent's evening. Language barriers. The parents may not speak English. They might feel very embarrassed to come and see the teacher. Then, of course, we've got the opposite end of the scale, where we've got the helicopter parents who hover over and are on your back every 5 minutes, 24/7, or the lawnmower parents. They are the ones that come in with the lawnmower and they make sure that that grass is flattened for their learner before they allow the learner to come into the school. So there are lots of instances and aspects. The tiger parents who expect their children to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and do 3 hours of work before they come to school. So remember that, people, we are dealing with very complex issues as well. And then, of course, inadequately and inappropriately trained education managers and educators. That's an exclusionary factor in itself. Please also remember, many of our teachers who are teaching in schools right now are in the age gap of 35 to 55 or even older. Those teachers never had any exposure to inclusive education other than training that we did when we did White Paper 6 and CS and guidelines for inclusive practices in schools. So those teachers never had, and they may have, of course, gone to workshops, but we all know sometimes workshops that you go to are quite ineffective because they're not professional learning communities. So be aware of that. Also, some district officials do not have enough experience in inclusion. And inclusion is relatively new to us. 1996, 2001 was when the white paper was established. So it's still relatively new, even though we've gone a number of years back. We know it's relatively new because of all the contextual realities in terms of the policy and the short-term and the long-term goals that haven't been met yet. So please remember that when you're looking at this in terms of development. Only now, in the last 2 years, 3 years, no, I'm lying to you, a little bit, maybe the last 4 years, there's been a huge impetus to ensure that in our qualifications now of newly graduated teachers, whether they're doing a PGC or a BEd, they have to have had inclusive education within their coursework. But again, there are issues there which we won't get into now. That's a whole nother lecture and a whole nother paradigm to discuss. All right, so some ideas that you can bring in. Discuss the complexities of moving towards inclusive education and schooling. There is no quick fix, even when it comes to professional development of staff, because inclusion isn't simple to implement. Inclusion means different things for different people. There also were the fears of many teachers, and still are, that am I going to land up, if I have to do full inclusion, am I going to land up with learners in my classroom that actually are not educable? Absolutely not. And we've got to move away. We've got to dismantle all these assumptions along the way. Because of course, if a child is medically unfit to be educated in an ordinary school, it would be inclusion by default. It would be going against the rights of that child to have them in a school. So please understand that, of course, there are going to be numerous factors. We call it reasonable adjustments or reasonable accommodations within the schooling environment. So be aware of that as well. Also think about how inclusion could be that principled response, the way in which we operate. How can we dismantle exclusion and provide, where we can, maximum participation of all? So just remember this term. In inclusion, what we want to do is we want to minimize any barriers to learning and maximize participation for all. So there's some stuff as well. So what I'd like you to think about when you're planning your essay, I want you to think of the quality and not the quantity. Draw on your Salamanca, draw on the Dakar, draw on white paper 6 and create that I'll show you just now, and choose some of those pertinent ideas to signpost exclusion and marginalization and show how inclusion would be a principled response to that. So if we just, again, there's something, I've just put these slides on to help you, to guide you. I'm not going to read through these. You can just have a look. So I've given you the UNESCO definition there of how they see inclusive education. Just key points as well. We have to monitor these moves to inclusion. Also, it needs to be a principled one. We have to argue. We have to eliminate inequality through the redistribution of resources. So what resources can we bring to our schools? And resources could be everything. It could be the human capacity, the teachers and the support people that are in place. And it could also be the infrastructure, the actual buildings. Think of those, okay? But redistributing resources isn't enough. And this is what South Africa tried to do in terms of the notion of special schools as resource centers. Those special schools as resource centers are supposed to be the place where we have those expert teachers, and believe me, we do. We have teachers in those schools who have been teaching for many years and have dealt and worked with many learners requiring assistance. They are the experts that can come in and assist us in the ordinary schools and the full service schools to reach full inclusion. Because we can go and ask those people, how do we deal with learners who aren't reading? How can we work with learners who need support in a certain way? And that is what we have tried to do within our South African system. So it's not about getting rid of special schools, although the new debate is those special schools should be dismantled or ought to be dismantled. We are working with reinforcing so we develop better collaboration. Because remember, collaboration is the cornerstone of inclusion. That's what it's all about. It's about you being able to knock on the neighborhood school's door and say, we need help. What have you done to develop your learners in this way? What have you done to bring in more inclusive practice? Because maybe we can share with you, we can learn from you, and vice versa, you can learn from us. Also, remember, it's always confusing, contested, and controversial. So Ainscough, in his work, Mel Ainscough, he's a UK inclusionist, he says, we have to think about different ways when we're looking at inclusion. We have to think about inclusion as a concern with disabled students and others categorized as having special educational needs. There goes our discussion we had on Saturday. Inclusion as a response to disciplinary exclusion. Inclusion in relation to all groups seen as being vulnerable to exclusion. Inclusion as developing the school for all. Remember, even Slee mentions all learners. Inclusion as education for all, and inclusion as a principled approach to education and society, human rights, Ubuntu, social justice. So we have to move away from language and principles that are there rather to label and categorize, and move towards how can we make our societies more just, more humane, more accepting. So there are some signs of hope. In many countries, school fees have been abolished, so it's creating, there we go, maximizing participation for all, allowing access for those learners. Remember I said to you in our discussion on Saturday as well, we need to be aware of what Wally Morrow called access to schooling, and he divided it up into two paradigms. The first one being formal access. Many learners have got formal access to school. They get into a motor car, they get into a taxi, they walk 6 kilometers and they get to school. They've got formal access, they belong to that school. But it goes deeper than that. A number of our learners do not have that epistemological access. And epistemological comes from the word episteme, which means knowledge. They don't have access to the curriculum because of exclusionary practices. And then we can go back to that slide I showed you on language issue from White Paper 6, schools not being accessible, teachers not being accessible or open to developing their practice in order to include. So UNESCO is also promoting child-friendly or inclusive schools. Inclusive education is now a right. Please understand that. So when people come to you and say, oh, inclusion's rubbish and you can never have inclusion and whatever, you turn around and you say to them, inclusion is a right. The inclusion of disabled children is often a catalyst for change and can challenge schools to be more inclusive. And again, remember, looking at the history of inclusion came out of an advocacy of parents who were fighting for the rights of their learners who were disabled to be in school. And then people who are passionate about sharing their experience of making inclusive education a reality. And I hope that that's going to be all of you. You're going to go back to your schools and your environments and you're going to say, we have to start making changes. Be an agent of change in your classroom. One small change is better than nothing. So remember that. And then also, just looking about threats that we have to equity in education, we have to start with existing practices. And again, that's why we come to the old notion of that inclusion is complex and that it is understood in different ways by different people. We need to look at where we are, start with those practices, start with our practices. So again, Avi will do a lot more of this with you. It comes from the top. It's looking at curriculum first, looking at policies, looking at all that, looking at the broader, wider, global approach before we can bring it down into a practice. But we start with what we're doing. What are the existing practices that are out there? We need to see difference as an opportunity, not as a threat. Oh, this is great. I've got this difference. What can I do with this difference? How can I make this work? We need to scrutinize barriers to participation. What is stopping learners from coming to school? What is stopping people from studying further, looking at ways of developing inclusion? We also need to develop a language of practice, and that's what we try to start with you in our first webinar. What is our language of practice? Are we going to be completely deficit model? Are we going to have a little bit, and that goes back to that slide I showed you on Saturday? Are we just linguistic bobbers, bobbing around with using our term and shaping and changing the way we speak? And we're going to do more of that as we move through the course. Also, creating conditions that encourage risk-taking. Inclusion isn't easy. You've got to sometimes take risks. And yes, sometimes you are going to fail. Merit didn't have time to give you examples also of some of the barriers that she faced and the constraints she faced. Remember, it took her 8 years to get to where her school is at this moment. And it's not perfect, as we know. There are lots of things that we can also critique in terms of the practices. However, there were changes. There were changes in terms of some of those learners who were removed out of other schools because schools didn't want them. They've succeeded and they've matriculated and they've gone on to university. So changes have been made, but those changes took a lot of risk. And a lot of risk also entails a lot of criticism, a lot of critique. So remember that you have to be brave. And then we also have to remain focused on promoting quality, inclusive education. And of course, we're going to bang our heads. We have not reached that gold standard. None of us have. Not any professor in inclusion, not any politician, not any lawmaker. However, if we can say to ourselves, we are making a difference, we are trying to do what we can do, we've come a step further. And then people, if you just have a look as well, I've given you a screenshot here. I did say to you, you can look at this as well. CREATE is the Consortium for Research on Educational Access, Transitions and Equity. It's the most amazing site. And what's nice is you can go in, you can look at those publications. I don't expect you to read a lot and do a lot with it, but if you want to just bring in some aspects of, like how many learners are at school, how many learners are out of school, and what this leads to in terms of exclusion for your essay, you can certainly use this as a resource as well. So I hope I've helped you in terms of just developing and shaping the way you need to put your essay together. I've also just put this in as well. This is just a lovely way of you looking at building an argument. So if you're saying one thing, remember an argument always has to have your claim, your main claim. So you can say schools in South Africa are not equal. Then you need to back it up with some reasons and then back it up with the readings, back it up with some evidence. So just look at that, and that may help you as well in terms of just shaping your essay. And then here are some of the examples, of the research that I used. Please just have a look at there where I've actually referenced the Salamanca statement and the Dakar. Please reference it in that way. You always start with UNESCO. So I've also given you a little tip of how to reference those two documents. If anybody still is not sure, you're most welcome to email me. But I hope today's little briefing has assisted you. Thanks very much.